Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is David Parsons. You're listening to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thanks for finding it. Thanks for locating the podcast wherever you're finding it. For those who are finding it on Jacobin, welcome. I appreciate your business. Even though this isn't a business, it's really just me recording myself talking to people that I think are smart. And really, the more I think about it, the more I think the show is partially about and for me as I track my own political evolution, and hoping that that listening to that evolution and that process is helpful to you as well, whoever and wherever you are. Today, my guest is James Oakes. He's a professor of history at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. He was one of the first professors that I sat in a class with during the opening years of my PhD program in history many, many years ago, I guess about 10 years ago. And he made a big impression on me. He kind of made me realize that I had to up my game in graduate school, because he just seemed like such a thoughtful and profound and smart person, particularly on the subject that we talked about today. He writes a lot about slavery and abolition and Civil War. His latest book is called Freedom National: The Destruction of Slavery in America. And we talk a lot about the process of abolition and why he is so into the idea of a political movement to end something as complicated and powerful as slavery in the United States. So I threw up some criticisms at him of that viewpoint in terms of the kind of main idea that you get from the left, and particularly an idea that I was certainly exposed to in my undergraduate years, was the idea that the Civil War didn't really accomplish much, that the end result was nil, particularly for obviously the black population in the South, who were doomed to a system of sharecropping and convict leasing and Jim Crow and racial violence for the next 100 years, which hardly could be seen as a victory. So I threw that criticism at James Oakes, and that's kind of a sticking point for him. He's very, very focused on abolition itself, and how the shift in the concept of human beings as property was accomplished. And so he did a great job of convincing me of his viewpoint during this talk, and I draw a lot of great ideas from what he has to say. So I hope you enjoy this conversation and keep listening to the Nostalgia Trap. You can find more episodes on iTunes. You can go to nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com to find all the episodes. You can go to Stitcher.com on Stitcher Radio Network and download the podcast there. And of course, like the Nostalgia Trap on Facebook, and you'll get updates on new episodes and all sorts of other stuff. So thanks again for listening. This is me talking to Professor James Oakes.
I went to a business school as an undergraduate, and in my first year, in my freshman English composition class, at the end of the first semester, my English professor called me to her office and said to me, if you stay as a business major, you'll be bored to tears. That's what she said. Bored to tears.
Is this at Baruch?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the class. I've been teaching at Baruch for 10 years, so I know this population of students well. Yeah.
Right. And it was a 4-credit, 1 semester English composition class, because the business students only had to take 1 semester, and the liberal arts kids had to take 2 3-credit semesters. So I took the 4-credit course, and she told me to get out of business right away. She said, I don't care what you do. I don't care whether you do English or political science or history, but if you stay in business, you'll be bored out of your mind.
What is it that you think that she recognized?
I have no idea.
So this was like this blindsided you. You should be like someone told you.
Yeah, because I came out of a I came out of a kind of working class Catholic school tradition where you sort of did what you were told, and nobody ever saw anything in you. You were just, you went this way or you went that way, and you just went with the flow. This was the first time I can remember anybody ever taking an interest in what I was and making me conscious of it.
Beyond just a robot.
Right.
Right.
And so I said, okay, and I wandered about in different courses for a year or two, and something very similar happened when I took the introductory survey of U.S. history, the second half, and had a teacher who, when I answered a question about Reconstruction, said I had answered it with a sufficient qualification that it made her say, "You have the makings of a good historian."
Do you remember what that qualification was, by chance?
I said that after the Civil War, the blacks were reduced almost to slavery. And because I didn't say reduced back to slavery, I said almost to slavery.
Yeah.
She liked that qualification.
That nuance.
Right. Yeah. and it was in a discussion of Kenneth Stamp's book on the era of Reconstruction. So, I was following, it's not so much the path of least resistance, but people were sort of inviting me in particular directions. And that same teacher became my mentor over the course of the next couple of years and guided me into classes, and at a certain point said to me one day, you should get a PhD.
And was history the subject?
At that point, I probably had become a history major. I was also a double major in education.
How did you find Baruch? I mean, did you think you were going to be an investment banker? Is that what you thought?
Yeah, I thought I was going to do international banking or something like that. I had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
I didn't know why I even thought that. But
right. I feel a lot of students at Baruch feel that way. They're kind of just, I deal with a lot of, my parents want me to be here.
Yeah, sort of. That was it. To the extent that my parents had any, my mother didn't, but to the extent that my father had any influence on those kinds of decisions, he just thought business was a good thing to do. Because he was a working class guy. He worked on the subways. He was a signal maintainer for the subways.
Were you raised in Brooklyn?
Staten Island.
In Staten Island.
I was born in the Bronx and grew up on Staten Island.
Were politics a part of your household as a kid?
Yes.
How so?
It was the only thing I really talked about with my father, because he wasn't a radical, but he was a kind of labor liberal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He was everything that he had gotten out of he grew up miserably poor. Miserably poor in the slums of New York as a kid in the Depression. And everything he achieved in his life, he claimed he had achieved because of unions. They got him a good job. They got him a steady salary. They got him a retirement package. They got him health care and stuff like that.
Right.
So he was a Hubert Humphrey liberal.
Okay.
And he was pro-civil rights. He liked Martin Luther King. And I lived in a kind of white working class Italian Irish group of people that weren't
big
sympathetic
Martin Luther
to that.
King fans.
Right. And there were riots.
Yeah.
And
those
people
are the
used
stories
to
of Martin Luther King visiting Chicago.
Exactly.
And
Exactly. So my father was different that way, and he never went the Reagan reaction route. He never did. He didn't have...
I think that was hard to resist for that generation, too.
Right. Well, he had... This is interesting, given what you're talking about. He had no nostalgia whatsoever for the past.
Well, that era, why would that generation
he was a
have
depression.
nostalgia?
He was a depression baby. He did not think things were better in the past when he was growing up. He thought they were better then. Right. And he thought when King gave his speech on Vietnam, he thought that was right.
Yeah.
So
the Beyond Vietnam speech,
Yeah. So I grew up in a household in which those ideas were taken for granted inside my house, but not taken for granted outside my house.
Right.
Even though I grew up in New York City, it was Staten Island, and it was not so. It was like today. It's not so liberal compared to the rest of the city.
No, Staten Island, I think, went for McCain in 2008.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit of a sense of embattlement, and so I guess I just grew up with those assumptions that labor unions are good things, not bad things.
Right. And what about the Vietnam War? Like, how did you relate to that? Because it seems like you were on the younger end. You weren't necessarily.
I was on the younger end, but during the moratoriums when they had, you could get for $10, you could get a bus down to Washington from the ferry terminal. They'd take you, and I did that. I went down to Washington for the anti-war demonstrations, and it's when I was in high school. It was hard. In retrospect, I guess I just took that politics for granted. I wasn't an activist. I wasn't going to join any organizations. But I just took that politics for granted.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it sounds like undergrad experience at Baruch is where you kind of like get set on fire in terms of thinking more about integrating your politics. And it doesn't sound like it was actually politics that got you into studying history, or was it?
Not directly. It was the peculiar institution.
Yeah.
And the era of Reconstruction. Those two books
became your obsession.
Those two books sort of, they were written by someone who turned out, as I got to know who he was, and was very also passionate about his politics.
This is Kenneth Stamp?
Right.
Yeah.
Who came out of a social democratic tradition in German Milwaukee, and also never went reactionary. Stayed that way until the day he died.
Isn't that funny that we have to point that out, that's like some anomalous thing? Right. He never went. I'm just waiting for it from like my parents. I'm embracing for it. Particularly because they're in California.
Well, because I ended up over the years meeting so many people for whom the '60s was a disastrous moment at which they turned away from democratic liberal politics.
Right, right.
And as the politics of the Democratic Party became more identity oriented as opposed to equality oriented.
Sure.
I also, pulled away from that.
Yeah.
It, as I said to you before we started talking, it took me a little while. It took probably most of us a little while to realize what was happening.
Well, I think it's a conversation we're having now. I think particularly because we're in an Obama era, a post-Obama era, or whatever, and there's this kind of like post-racial impulse on one end, but then there's this other end that's kind of like thinking, what are the limits of identity politics? And to have a president like Obama, for me, it's not entirely about identity. His failure is not entirely about identity. It's more about the system itself and kind of how the structure of warfare and corporations and everything else. There's not much that one dude can do about it. But yeah, I think that's the reason, probably one of the main reasons we're having this conversation now about identity politics.
It's not so much
it's brought us.
We can explain his failure in terms of all those structural impediments, as well as his own contributions to the failure. But the real failure is the inability of people who are disappointed in him to figure out what it takes.
What's next? Yeah.
To change that situation.
Right.
And there, I think, is where the commitment to identity politics is really a stumbling block.
Yeah.
Still.
Well, let's talk a little bit about where this developed, because you went to Berkeley for graduate school. So you took the advice of this person at Baruch and went to go get a PhD in history at Berkeley. And what years were you there?
74 to 81.
Okay. And so, I've on this show, I've talked to people like Barbara Garson and Todd Gitlin and a few others that were there, at the creation of the Berkeley mythology of the free speech movement in the early 60s.
Have you talked to Robbie Cohen down at NYU?
No,
You should talk to him.
Is he at the Tamiment Library?
No, he teaches in the education department at NYU. He knows more about that than anybody, and he's really good about it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that era, but I'm also glad to talk to you because the 70s at Berkeley are a total mystery to me. Like what it looked like after that, and after People's Park has been broken up, and Reagan's no longer governor, right? And there's something something else going on in that campus. So you talked about earlier before we turned on the recorder about like the tables changing, but what was it? What was the political scene like at Berkeley when you were there?
I can tell you that among my cohort there was a sense of well, we just missed it, didn't we? Right? Yeah. We were just too young to have participated in that, and it's not so much. Berkeley was still. There's a difference between what the student body was and what the faculty was. Always, although many of the faculty were actively engaged in the politics, but it was still politically active. The tables were all there in Sproul Plaza. You couldn't walk through Sproul Plaza and not notice how intensely political the campus was, at least at that spot. But there were no great issues about the university and the multiversity or the various issues that grew up that were so big in the 60s, and part of the free speech movement had won. Was the Vietnam War even the focus at all? No, it was pretty much over. It was pretty much over, and Reagan was winding down as governor. I got there in his last months as governor, and Jerry Brown became the governor, and so he was not the kind of
he's still the
divisive figure that Reagan was. So it was obviously it was less political than it had been a decade earlier, and there was a sense that things had gotten worse because it was less political and less radical, or something like that. And there was a bit of nostalgia for the 60s.
Yeah, was there like I imagine people had beards and long hair, and it was kind of still a hippie kind of scene.
Yeah, they were there. Yeah, I guess. Not if you look at pictures of me, I had long hair and
did you
beard.
really?
Yeah. I had hair.
I have proof of that, and I found at a bookstore in Saratoga a few years ago. I found a copy of The Ruling Race.
Yeah,
I think it was the first,
hardcover.
Yeah, I think it's the first. I should have brought it for you to sign today because it's got your picture. And I said, "That's James Oates' hair."
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
Right.
Yeah, different era. I'm sure for all of
us.
But
I should say that I was not, and still am not, a joiner about those things. I on the one hand, I am and have always been pretty intensely political.
Yeah.
But I also try to keep a separation. I'm not a joiner.
We all noticed that as kind of eager young. Marxist type graduate students in your class years ago, my cohorts, we all were kind of like outside of your class trying to crack your politics, because we had to do it through your work essentially, because you never kind of like, other professors would come in and we'd talk about the day's events and we would kind of all go off about current politics. Not always, but with you it just felt like your politics are present in your work very much. Like you have and I want to get to that, but like kind of like what you're up to about the Civil War and Reconstruction and Lincoln. There's definitely a purpose underneath that, but it was all opaque for us in terms of today's politics, because we wanted to know more about where you were politically. But I think that's right. You're not a I guess joiner is one way of putting it, but you're not someone who's on the soapbox a lot.
Right. In fact, I feel a little when I do publish pieces in like Jacobin or somewhere else, I feel a little self-conscious about it.
Yeah.
Partly because I don't want to piggyback any of my politics onto whatever reputation I have as a historian. Partly because, not so much because I believe in the separation of my work from my politics so much as I don't think that being a historian or being an academic gives me any special insight
into politics.
Yeah. One of the things that has always struck me about academics and their politics is how proud they are to have a politics.
Right. Yeah.
When, my feeling is I could go down to any corner bar and listen to some guy spout his politics, and everybody has a politics. And
I feel like spouting politics is whatever you want to call that, is kind of spouting answers in a sense, and the academic inquiry is inquiry, right? It's like asking questions, and that's kind of the main mode of what you're doing is kind of like being agnostic a little bit about history.
Exactly. And also because the politics that tended to get spouted always struck me as not very interesting. and that I don't know, I didn't feel like I was, as the politics became identity politics.
Yes.
And as the field began to become identity history, right? So that what counted as a diverse history department ceased to be a department, let's say in U.S. history, that had a political historian, a constitutional historian, a military historian, an economic historian, a social historian, became instead a series of identities, right? Yeah. We needed a women's historian, a gay historian, an African-American historian, Korean-American historian, those Asian-American historians. So diverse history departments became to me less and less diverse in some ways.
Right.
We studied more and more
in terms of the history being told and the type of history, right?
Exactly. So I watched this development with increasing skepticism, even though my politics were they didn't fit with that.
Right.
They didn't fit with that.
Well, it's a thing we had talked about identity politics before, which is such a paradox for me to talk about, and it always makes me uncomfortable to talk about in a sense because I'm a white male, so I'm kind of like saying, oh, identity politics is that's the turn where everything went to hell, is when all these other voices appeared.
Right.
But it seems like and perhaps that's something that we can reach for in the future, is it like an integration of identity and politics rather than identity replacing politics or identity replacing history in that sense.
I mean, I think these are... something very good happened to the professional study of history in history departments, and that is the a welcome and necessary expansion in the peoples we studied. So we now do much more than we used to do with African history and Latin American history and Asian history, and I think was necessary and good and has made us better as departments. But within those fields, it didn't ever strike me that we needed to do it all as social cultural history. The political economy of West Africa is much more interesting to me than cultural identities of West Africans.
Right. I remember you saying, you lamenting, and I kind of like, because I do, I mean, I guess in a sense I do partially like cultural history, in a sense I do, and like I read something of yours, you lamenting the turn to culture in the 60s, and I think it was in The Advocate you had said the turn to culture. Like, what is that? What you're kind of referring to? The turn?
Yeah, that cultural history is fine, but it became overwhelming.
Right.
So that we walk down the halls now, and you don't, as a matter of course, bump into an economic historian as your colleague, or a military historian, or a political historian. You bump into another social cultural historian, and they talk the same language, and they use the same theoretical apparatuses, and the result is the expansion of the peoples we study has come at the expense of a narrowing of the intellectual apparatus we use to study various
which
peoples.
Is ironic, because it's like ostensibly the project of this was supposed to kind of open up the institution to all these different voices, but then it kind of narrows the type of discourse you're having.
So we haven't found a way to balance that need to have more ways of doing things, because it's important. I mean, war is important, and it would be nice to have somebody around who you could tell you that the Civil War was different from other wars for these reasons, so that you don't go off making mistakes. For example, or an economic historian who can explain something that's going on that you don't understand is going on, because that's not the way you do it. But you don't have these people around just on a day-to-day basis who can, guide you and tell you you've made a mistake, or
it seems like the field of history has changed a lot in those, in those years.
Economic historians are now in economics departments. Legal constitutional historians are now in law schools. Intellectual historians are, for the most part, in philosophy departments or English departments, and we just do social and cultural history now.
Well, you don't. I mean, you do political economy type stuff, and so what is it like doing that within the context of that larger historiographical shift? Do you feel like a man alone doing this kind of history? Do you feel like you're doing an old-fashioned type of history, or do you I mean,
no,
it's almost
I
like
think
a political act in that context
right.
for you to write the stuff that you do.
Well, I come out of social history, so I can't ever turn against social history.
Yeah.
I'm not repudiating my origins. I still think that history, you still do have to do history from the bottom up as part of what you do, but not all of what you do.
Right. I think that's what the key we're getting at here. It's like it can't be all that.
Right. It's not enough.
Yeah.
It's necessary but not sufficient. So when I wrote Freedom National, I went out of my way to incorporate what's going on the ground and how that's not necessarily an obvious reflection of what was being said in Washington. On the other hand, that means that you have to pay more rather than less attention to what's going on in Washington. You can't assume that you know what's going on in Washington because you can't figure out or see what's going on the ground. You can't discern a pattern. And if you can't discern a pattern and that's part of the problem, you see. It's a repudiation of any notion that there are structures within which people operate, that the structures within which people operate are being determined by legal boundaries that are created by policymakers and things like that. Right. So that if you just look on the ground and see mess, all you're going to see is mess. And without any... You can't see the forest for the trees. You make simple, basic mistakes. You see somebody say to, a slaveholder comes to a Union Army camp in late 1861 and says, "I want my slaves." They've run into your lines, and the Union officer says to them, "Go away and get a sheriff or a judge to we don't do that. You need to get a local official." And if you don't know that for 30 years, anti-slavery people have been insisting that the federal government is not responsible for the capture and return of runaway slaves, that should be done by local state and local officials. They're actually implementing a policy. Right? Yeah. If you don't know that, you'll say, well, they're just sloughing it off onto the local people. And, you got to know what the policy is. You know what's
that larger context.
Right.
Because otherwise it looks like something else.
Exactly. And you got to know that policy came out of a radical anti-slavery movement and made its way into the mainstream and pushed its way and succeeded.
Right. So. The slavery issue, what is it about that issue and about that history that kind of fascinated you at Berkeley? Is that what you did your dissertation on?
Yeah. I did my dissertation on the slaveholders, that first.
Was that Ruling Race?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was my dissertation.
How did you come to that?
Well, I went there interested in two things. I was interested in the Cold War, and I was interested in slavery. And when I got to Berkeley, there was one person who did the Cold War and 8 people who did slavery or some form. And it was a big time for slavery. The mid-'70s were kind of a golden age. That's when everybody was screaming and yelling about Fogel and Ingerman.
That's right.
Within a few years, Roll Jordan Roll came out, and Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom came out, and the second volume of David Bryan Davis's book came out, and I got to Berkeley, and Winthrop Jordan was teaching the first survey for U.S. historians, and Leon Litwack was working on Been in the Storm So Long, and Kenneth Stamp was still teaching, and Sellers was working on the Market Revolution book, and Larry Levine was working on his book on black culture and black consciousness, and Al Rabbitoe was working on his book on slave culture. It was all over the place.
Where did that explosion come from? Was it connected to the kind of post-civil rights moment? Was it connected to what was going on in the society, or was it just kind of an accident of the historiography? Why did that 70s moment happen in slavery and history?
I don't know. I don't know. I can't explain. I don't know why there was a Southern Renaissance in the 1920s either. I just don't know. I don't know.
It just happened.
But for whatever reasons, that was going on there, and it was very exciting. And that's what I obviously gravitated towards.
Right.
So it was easy to do, and I was fortunate in that I liked all of those people, and could have worked with any of them, and did work with most of them, and wasn't particularly obsessed with working with one or the other of those people.
And at what moment did you kind of realize, if there was a moment, kind of what your intervention would be, at least at that time at Berkeley, what your kind of space would be to talk about slavery? Because it just seems, and I say that as a graduate student, being around all these professors and writers that are writing this kind of really groundbreaking stuff, how do you kind of construct your own voice through all of that?
I don't know. I mean, it's if I look back on it, I suppose it's that first book is a synthesis of the various forces influencing me while I was there.
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan was obviously pioneering the study of race. So
right.
Race gets into my title
right.
of my first book.
But race in a subversive way, in a sense.
Yeah, well, yeah. I was trying to put class and race together in a single title.
Yeah.
At that point, not very sophisticated about how it was being conceptualized, but a basic sort of understanding that. I remember in a seminar, Stamp pounding his fist on the table, saying it's race and it's class. It's race and it's class. But we didn't have much in the way of theoretical sophistication there at that point.
Yeah.
All the theoretical chatter at Berkeley at that point was anthropology.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it was cultural anthropology.
Yeah,
it was Natalie Davis was there, and Larry Levine was doing the folk songs and folk culture and stuff like that. And my third field on my orals was anthropology, and my outside field was cultural anthropology. And so we were all going around the halls talking about Clifford Geertz and Balinese cockfights.
That was in vogue.
And the abominations of Leviticus and Mary Douglas and that's the kind of stuff that Victor Turner, what is liminality? That was the theoretical apparatus, and I was not the only person who ever at Berkeley told me I needed to read Marx was Sellers. Sellers told me that I couldn't consider myself a self-respecting intellectual if I hadn't come to terms with Marx.
So how did that process
he's the one
happen?
also who told me to read Genovese.
Did you just go to a Berkeley bookstore and pick up Das Kapital that day? And then
No, I didn't. I didn't do it there.
Yeah.
I did it when I got to Princeton.
So after your dissertation is when Marx you come to terms with Marx.
Right. Because Marx gave me the theoretical apparatus that I could have used in my first book.
Yeah, and it seems like your work since has kind of been, you've cut out this kind of space about capitalism and how it relates to slavery.
Right.
Like what is that relationship?
Right.
And it's one that it seems like it's shifted for you even over the years. I think you kind of like come back and forth to it, but it seems like slavery is capitalism to you. Is that right?
No.
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 Slavery is perhaps more capitalism than other historians would say it is.
I'll say the question that needs to be asked is what is the relationship between the development of modern slavery and the development of capitalism, because they go hand in hand.
Right.
So there were two great intellectual debates that shaped the way I came to Marxism, and they didn't talk to one another. And the one was the transition debate, the Dobbs-Sweezy debates, and the Brenner debate, which introduced me to Marxism through historical study, taught me to think about class as a dynamic theory of history. And then there was the Williams thesis and the debate over slavery and capitalism, right? And the Williams thesis implicitly contradicted the Brenner, Dobbs-Sweezy stuff. That they're arguing that capitalist development is a function of the internal class dynamics of the societies that become capitalist.
Right.
And Williams is saying there's this stuff coming out from across the Atlantic that is making capitalism happen. Right? And one is saying that commerce isn't going to do it, and the other is saying that commerce in the form of the profits of slavery is what did it.
Right.
And so there's a way in which my whole life intellectually is an attempt to figure these two things out.
To mitigate that a little bit.
To mediate it, to figure out what is in fact the relationship between the two.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't, it's still evolving. It really, the first thing I noticed in my first book, empirically, is that these people are not repudiating the values of the market. They're not paternalistic. They're not turning away from these, they're not neo-feudal lords or anything like that. So no matter what the theoretical sophistication of the people I was disagreeing with, there was just no way I was going to go there because it didn't work empirically.
Right.
What I needed and didn't have was a theoretical apparatus that could explain that in terms of the general trajectories of the modern world, which for me, the history of the modern world is the history of capitalism. That's what it is. And the state structures that go with it, and the history of slavery is the history of the relationship and its place in the emergence of capitalism.
Is slavery exist as kind of a warning of what capitalism is capable of? Is that one way of putting it?
It's I don't know. I don't know if I would put it as a warning of that capitalism as a system has no trouble absorbing a lot of different forms around itself, around its periphery.
Right.
So that to the extent that capitalist development is, take Pomerantz, right? It's coal and colonies. Well, colonies really mean slavery. It's slave colonies he's talking about, because the goods he's talking about producing are the slave-produced goods from the plantations in the New World. So that makes slave plantations in the New World a central element in the evolution of capitalism in England.
Right.
So there's an internal development in England that is closely related to what's going on in the empire. So it's increasingly, to me, it's the imperial context. It's the degree to which the New World plantations are basically colonies of the capitalist world. And the peculiar aspect of the U.S. is that the colony exists inside the nation state, which is its own empire.
Right. It's insane to think about it that way.
Right.
The colony inside the United States.
Well, for example, if you think 1776, what the American Revolution does is move the locus of the American empire moves across the Atlantic from London to the east coast of the United States. And from that point on, the debate over slavery that begins at that moment is a debate over what the kind of empire the United States is going to be.
And what's amazing to me is how the story of slavery for a lot of Americans is a story about a few central figures, and that story is often reduced to Abraham Lincoln essentially, and yet you're someone who's complicated the story. I'm sorry, I'm just going to plug in this thing real quick.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. So this figure of Lincoln often kind of oversimplifies the Civil War story.
Yeah.
And yet, you have spent some time in recent years thinking a lot about Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
And kind of repositioning Lincoln as this other figure that we're perhaps familiar with. When did Lincoln become such a figure for you to kind of unpack all of these bigger issues?
Well, it was the decision to move from the history of slavery to the history of anti-slavery started, but it was also came out of that sense that it's very hard to describe. I mean, there was a way in which it began as an emotional desire. I was sick of studying slavery.
Yeah.
And I wanted to study some people I liked instead of people I didn't particularly like or didn't want to be condescending about and things like that. So, and I wanted to figure out what the relationship between the radical abolitionist movement and the Republican Anti-Slavery Party was. So it started with these two figures of Lincoln and Douglass.
Right.
I wanted to figure out Douglass. I didn't know much about Douglass. I had trouble positioning him in my own mind and where he was in American American history, and at least in the anti-slavery thought. Lincoln, I thought I knew, and turned out didn't really know.
What is it that you thought you knew that changed the most?
I basically took the without much thinking about it. I took the view that he was a reluctant emancipator, that he took a while for him to come around to the realization that the war was about slavery, and that. But I mean, I didn't have strong feelings about it because I never really thought that much about Lincoln anyway.
It seems like the standard line among radicals about Lincoln is that kind of like Horace Greeley letter, where he doesn't care if he frees a single slave or whatever. I think Howard Zinn made a lot of noise about that.
But everybody does. Conservatives, radicals, lots of people love that letter, and you know, it took me a while to see what was going on in that letter.
Yeah.
But the first time I dealt with him was in the Lincoln and Douglas book, the Frederick Douglass Abraham Lincoln book, and that's where it started to change, because the depth and sincerity and long-standing hatred of slavery is obvious. Became very obvious to me
from Lincoln.
Yeah, and I was surprised by that he really did hate slavery. He always hated slavery, and he said he always hated slavery, and there's not and every piece of evidence we have indicates that that's the case. And he hated it for moral reasons, philosophical reasons.
Not even necessarily religious reasons.
Not religious. He just thought it was a violation of the principle of fundamental human equality. Without that Declaration of Independence, the United States is nothing. That's the fundamental founding principle. It's what makes the United States different. What makes the United States what it is as a nation in the world of nations and things like that. And so and he wasn't all that interested in what is commonly understood as the free labor ideology. One of the things I was looking for in Lincoln.
Boner stuff.
Well, a version of it.
Yeah,
I mean, he believes in free labor. He believes in the superiority of free labor and those kinds of things. But he doesn't. It's not obvious to me. To this day, it's not obvious to me that he thought slave labor was less efficient than free labor. It is the Seward version of free labor ideology, which leads Seward to believe that slavery is going to die inevitably anyway, and we don't need a war, and causes all that nonsense with Seward at the beginning of the war. I'm not sure Lincoln believed that. I'm not sure he bought that.
That it was going to naturally
that version of free labor. I think
that will just. I think people tend to believe that now, that slavery was just something that would just going to die eventually, and you didn't really have to intervene in any way because it was an old feudal institution that didn't really fit into this modern industrial world.
Right. It's a logical deduction from a certain version of free labor ideology, but Lincoln's free labor ideology was basically moral. Right. It was just people. The natural right to self-proprietorship is one of the founding principles of the United States. It's immoral for one person to claim a right of property in another person. And it was that the centrality of the property issue that caused me ultimately to go back to where I started 30 years ago in the ruling race, and to clarify some of the things that I couldn't clarify at that point, which is that this is a debate about that what slavery is basically is the commodification of the entire human being rather than merely the labor power of the human being.
Right.
And that fundamental distinction is not simply it tells you what the difference in the entire political economy of a slave society is versus what the political economy of the North is, but it also explains the terms of the debate, that people at the time understood it in those terms.
Yeah.
Right. And that's
even people who were saying that the factory workers in the North were slaves too. Right. That distinction about property is pretty critical to understanding that, right?
Exactly. And it goes way back. It goes back to the you see it already in the radicals of the English Revolution in the 17th century. When the Quakers start calling slavery man-stealing, well, what's being stolen? Right? Yeah. If slavery is a form of theft, what is it that's being stolen? It's the property right you have in yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So it's self-proprietorship versus property rights in human beings, in other human beings. That was the terms of the debate. That was the central core, and that brought me back to where I was at the beginning, which is that slavery is not about the repudiation of market values. It's the opposite. It's hyper-commodification. It's, in Marx's terms, the double commodification. It is the complete and total commodification of the human being, which is an ancient form of subordination, paired to the highly rationalized, systematic production of commodities for the capitalist world that makes modern slavery doubly commodified, hyper-commodified.
And that period of intersection of those two historical impulses just creates this kind of like devastating...
Exactly. It's what American makes modern slavery different from previous forms of slavery. So it links slavery to the capitalist world fundamentally. It makes the internal dynamics of Southern slavery crucial. So it's not simply a kind of anachronistic social systems plopped down in the midst of a world that outside of it is capitalist. It's that it's right there inside the whole project. It's there every day in the plantations. It's there. That's what the slaves are there for.
Right.
They're there for the rational, systematic production of commodities on a scale and to a degree that was not to be matched until you get factories.
And that system goes to war with itself ultimately to kind of shift the definition of those people generally, right? Like, I mean, it seems like, you know, the movie Lincoln that came out a few years ago, you know, kind of, I resisted watching it for a long time because I felt like, well, this is going to be a bunch of, you know, Hollywood mythology, etc. And in some sense it is, but there's a real focus on the 13th Amendment, and made me think of you, because can you explain a little bit about the kind of what the relationship between the Emancipation Proclamation and, like, did you think it was right for them, in other words, in the movie to, like, kind of concentrate on the 13th Amendment as being that vital to the whole kind of reflecting Lincoln's political soul?
Yeah, that's the part of the movie that I liked.
Yeah,
that usually when people focus, to the extent that they even bother to focus on the 13th Amendment, they do so to denigrate Lincoln. But one of the things that the movie does make clear and is accurate about is that Lincoln himself understood in many ways more clearly than most people at the time and most historians since then have done the limits of military emancipation. He was always skeptical that issuing an Emancipation Proclamation was going to do it.
Right.
Was going to be enough to destroy slavery.
It's like an executive order, essentially.
Well, it's not so much that. It's that in practical terms, all he could legally be sure about was that slaves who were actually physically emancipated by the war, who had actually, by the time the war ended, come into Union lines and been practically, as he put it, in practice, freed, would be freed. But he never thought that there would be enough of those to actually destroy slavery completely. Right? So his major goal was to get the states to abolish slavery. And he continued. Then he came to see the Emancipation Proclamation as a sort of this big stick that he could use to get the states to abolish slavery. And it worked. He got, no state had abolished slavery since 1804. And then suddenly, in the war, 5 slave states abolished slavery, plus West Virginia, plus the admission of Kansas and Nevada. So that by the end of the war, an Emancipation Amendment, an abolition amendment that's inconceivable given the balance of power between free and slave states in 1860, 18 free states, 15 slave states, becomes, by the end of the war, because of this push for state abolition, 26 free states and 10 slave states. An abolition amendment to get 3/4 of the states is feasible in 1865 in a way that it wasn't feasible, in part because of both the Emancipation Proclamation and the push to get states to abolish slavery. But Lincoln never believed the Proclamation would be enough.
It seems to me that you're kind of recovering the primacy of politics to the whole abolitionist project in a sense, because I think a lot about because I use this chapter so much from Howard Zinn's book, because not because of the point of view, but because of his writing and the way that he kind of he presents thought experiments about this stuff that I think allows undergrads in particular an entry into talking about like what are the major issues. He says something along the lines of, when he's talking about John Brown, I always remember this part, we're talking about John Brown being executed, and he said the state executed a man who attempted to do by small-scale violence what Lincoln would do with large-scale violence and kill 600,000 people unnecessarily, when the abolitionists could have, he posits this, in other words, he like kind of posits this idea, this fantasy that the abolitionists, like radical abolitionists, could have waged the war or waged an attack on slavery that would have been successful beyond that. In other words, we didn't need to arm hundreds of thousands of troops, and that slaughter was not necessary. How do you envision like what the war was? It just seems like that, because it seems like that Zinn's position is kind of takes politics out of it in a sense.
Right. It makes.
And I know like the John Brown thing is radicals love that kind of image of him, and it's like a kind of a romantic idea that like he was the real dedicated person and Lincoln was some sort of sellout pro-capitalist dude. Where are you on those debates? I think I have a general idea, but it seems like you're more on the political side of things. Like you're.
Well, I think it underestimates the success that the radical anti-slavery movement had in framing the anti-slavery agenda of the Republican Party, to which Lincoln was committed, and all Republicans were committed. Almost all Republicans were committed. So that's one thing. It also underestimates the political sophistication of the abolitionists. This way in which the abolitionists rhetorically call for immediate emancipation, but they know that the Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to abolish slavery in state. So what does it mean? In practical terms, their project from the start is to use whatever power the federal government can constitutionally use to restart the process of state-by-state abolition and get the states to abolish slavery on their own. Surround the South with a cordon of freedom. Make the free states really free states by not allowing the federal government to come into the states and enforce the fugitive slave law.
Right.
Suppress slavery on the high seas. Ban it from the territories. Don't allow any new slave states in. Encourage the process that's already underway by which the slaves are moving out of the border states in the upper South and into the lower South, so that the border states will eventually abolish slavery. And you'll only be left with these deep South states, and then the cordon will move closer and strangulate the South until, like a scorpion girt by fire, slavery will sting itself to death. That's the abolitionist project. They want to restart the process of state-by-state abolition that had successfully resulted in the abolition of slavery in the North. In fact, that created the place we call the North. The North is the place where all where slavery was abolished.
Right.
The accumulation of states that abolish slavery becomes the North. Right. The accumulation of states that do not abolish slavery becomes the South, more or less. Right. And from that point on, the political crisis between the North and the South is pretty clear and consistent. Right. From then, there's a kind of shutdown in the 30s when the two big political parties suppress anti-slavery politics. But the abolitionists immediately address that and start pushing it back into the system, and successfully make that cordon of freedom, that attempt to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction, the policy of the Republican Party. That's why the slave states seceded. They're not hysterical. They're not reacting to a non-existent threat. They're leaving because the abolitionists have successfully formulated a political agenda that is designed to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. And the slave South has to decide. Are we going to stay here and put up with this, or are we going to leave and protect slavery? It wasn't an ideal choice, and some of the slave states, for obvious reasons, chose to stay with the Union and protect themselves that way, and some chose to leave.
Yeah.
But they all had to make a decision.
one way or another.
Right.
And I mean, it seems like that's politics, right? I mean, that's kind of like surrounding and enforcing.
Right.
It was one of the guests I've talked to, Howard Levy, who was in the GI movement. He said that he doesn't like the left anymore because they don't make the system make a move. They don't force a move.
Well, this is the thing that to the extent that my politics are driving any of this, it's really, here we have an example in American history, and there aren't too many, but here we have an example of a genuinely successful radical movement to transform the social structure and political economy of the nation. And it works. It doesn't work exactly the way anybody planned for it to work, but no movements work the way anybody planned. You can't plan these things out. But it worked.
Yeah.
And so what I've been spending the last 10 years of my life trying to figure out is, what does it take
well, I mean,
to make a movement successful? And it obviously is systematic organization, a recognition that you can't, however clogged up and unresponsive the political system seems or is at any given point, you've got to figure out a way to break through that, because that's where the power is. You've got to get your hands on the levers of power, and you've got to make this happen and figure out a way to make it happen that is viable politically.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like that's why your project about Lincoln is complicated, because it's not about the personality of Lincoln and
the party
rescuing. It's the party, and it seems like Lincoln is the representative of a particular kind of political strategy.
Exactly. So I'm not really concerned about questions like, was he
racist or not racist?
No. Was he slower than the radicals? Was he faster? Was he, those questions he's a party guy, he comes a little bit later than other Republicans to the 13th Amendment, but he comes to the 13th Amendment when the party comes to the 13th Amendment, you know? And, he doesn't talk much before the Civil War about every aspect of the cordon. And he has his own view of what the Fugitive Slave Clause obligates the federal government to do. That's different from the mainstream of his party. But when the party passes all these laws, it's obvious he's committed to the cordon. He immediately, upon taking office, his Secretary of State starts negotiating this treaty with Great Britain to suppress slavery on the high seas. That has been on the abolitionist agenda for decades, right? And it gets done almost exclusively, it has to by definition get done exclusively by the Lincoln administration. So Congress passes a law abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., and he signs it. Congress passes a law banning slavery from the territories, and he signs it. Congress passes a law requiring West Virginia to abolish slavery as a condition for admission to the Union, and he signs it. He doesn't veto any of these bills. He signs all of them. Even if I would have liked it done a little differently, I would have liked it done this way rather than that way, but I'm on board with the basic project.
Yeah.
He's on board.
And it's not so much a grand strategy on Lincoln's part. It's more kind of being, he's amorphous enough as a politician to essentially kind of like,
well, I think people misunderstand
what's happening as it happens.
Right. I think people misunderstand. For example, his position on the border states. They say that it took him so long to come to emancipation because he was obsessed with keeping the border states in the Union. Well, it would have been easy to keep the border states in the Union if he hadn't also wanted them to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
But the problem of the border states arose because he was telling them abolish slavery and stay in the Union at the same time, and they're having a fit. The slaveholders in those states don't have enough power to get those states out of the Union. So they're having a fit. They're having a fit because because he wants to keep them in the Union, but because he wants them to abolish slavery and keep them in the Union. And to a remarkable degree, it works.
So you can look at the project as the abolitionist project as a success, especially if you define the project the way you are, which is that it was about kind of redefining this notion of property, and a human being could be property.
Exactly.
But how do you deal with the kind of like Douglas Blackman, like Slavery by Another Name, the kind of cynics about Reconstruction that it's compelling, a lot of it, about kind of the the systems that were set up, particularly like around prisons and prison labor, and that there was, after the war, the substantive reality for black people in the South was not much different than it was in slavery. How do you deal with that stuff?
Well,
because it goes back to your first thing in undergrad where you said they were not
right, almost slaves. Right. I wouldn't say that now, by the way.
How would you correct?
I would say that there are the capacity of human beings to devise ways of subordinating other people is distressingly ubiquitous.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There are many, many different ways in which a human being can subordinate another human being, right? And one of them is by making them property, personal property. Patriarchy is another way of doing it.
Right.
Serfdom is another way of doing it. Sharecropping and the system that emerged in the South after this war is another way of doing it. It's not slavery by another name. It's horrible, but it's not slavery by another name. And it doesn't work the same way that slavery does. The political economy doesn't function the same way that slavery does. And to some extent, what you're seeing is the counter-revolution's attempt to get around the fact that they can no longer enslave these people and find other ways of subordinating them.
Yeah. And they were successful in some respects.
In some respects they were, but not in all respects.
Yeah.
Because there were certain, marriages were legal.
Yeah.
It really is different to go from a system in which it is a crime to teach a slave to read to one in which black children are taught in inferior schools.
Yeah.
They're just not the same. It's two different things.
And it seems like you're not terribly interested in making historical judgments about like what's better or worse. You're more about kind of like describing the shades of what capitalism does in a sense. Like when I hear you, like slavery is one shade of what capitalism can produce, and sharecropping is another shade of what it can produce.
It's just I'm interested in the struggles.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that you need to understand, one of the ironic achievements of abolition, and it happened in the North beginning in the late 18th century when the northern states began to abolish slavery, and it happened again in the South when slavery was abolished there. One of the things that the abolition of slavery, because it was racial slavery, does is create the conditions for a civil rights movement. You can't have a civil rights movement under slavery.
Yeah.
Nobody believes that slaves don't have civil rights.
Right.
They're not citizens. They just don't. Right? So what abolition does, it does a couple of things. Because the abolitionists themselves tended to favor civil rights, that issue is on the table during the abolition struggle. What abolition does is create a free black community that is committed to civil rights, to equal rights, and throws the issue on the table for all voters to consider. Right? So abolition creates the conditions that produce a civil rights movements and struggles over racial equality in the North from the late 18th century onward, and in the South from the Civil War onward, right? More or less. The fact of those struggles, the fact that you have blacks and whites struggling against racial inequality, does not prove that abolition didn't mean anything. It proves exactly the opposite.
Right.
Those struggles exist because of abolition.
Right? Yeah.
So the success of any one...
There's no Martin Luther King Jr. without a 13th Amendment first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as what I said in the piece in Jacobin.
Yeah.
All revolutions are unfinished.
Yeah.
All victories are partial. Right? They set up the conditions for the next set of struggles, and it's just
well. And then we'll wrap it up here. But I mean, I feel like the importance of history is a vital part of it, in the sense that, if you're judging Lincoln live as it happens, if like we all had Facebook pages and Twitter feeds, people would be. I feel like the conversation about Lincoln would be very different than the conversation we're having now, in the sense that, it's hard to see what's going on on the ground level, and it's happening as it's happening live, and I feel like, because the Obama administration partially, or just politics in general today are kind of like spoken to us in a live way. We kind of debate the issues as they're happening. It feels like we lose that historical hindsight in a sense, and we're kind of like unmoored. Does that make sense to you? That's the idea.
It's very hard. It's very hard to get any kind of historical perspective on what's happening now.
Right.
We can bring historical perspective to what's happening now, but it's hard to see because in 50 years, if everybody has agreed that Reaganism was a failure, they might rename Reagan Airport into something else, into Obama Airport or something.
Right.
But who knows what it's going to look like 50 years from now? I never would have imagined in my lifetime that we would be in a situation in which the dominant interpretation among historians who view themselves as progressive is that the abolition of slavery was a waste of time.
You think they really feel that
it achieved nothing?
Yeah, that it achieved nothing. Right.
That the war was a bloodletting that didn't produce any meaningful results. I never would have imagined that I always understood that why a white Southern conservative would say that, but that we would reach the point where African Americans and progressives and people who think of themselves as on the left would say such things, that I never would have imagined.
Yeah. No, it's kind of an incredible turn, and it goes to what your project. I think I understand a little bit more about what your project is about, which is kind of, taking another look at that period. And reading it in a different way than the
if you're waiting for heaven on earth
today, which is Civil War was a big giant industrial war that did nothing for black people and did nothing to change the status of the people that were enslaved.
Yeah, if you're waiting for heaven on earth, if you're waiting for the victory of the angels, you're going to wait until you die.
Yeah,
because that doesn't happen.
No, it takes work. It takes political work.
But yeah.
It's great stuff. Thanks so much for talking to me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.